Hi, everyone. So we're going to take a look here real quick at our week 7 written responses assignment. Make sure that you've gone through the week 7 module and that you have read chapters 9 and 13. This assignment in particular, you're really going to want to have a pretty good understanding of the material covered in both chapters so that you can more easily answer the questions on this assignment. Right? Make sure that you're doing this in whatever file format that you've been using up until this point. If something happens and you run into problems with, being able to upload a file, definitely reach out. But otherwise, however you've been doing things up until this point should work. So our chapter 7 questions. Question 1, I want you to think back to the Milgram experiment that we discussed back in week 1, chapter 1. So this was one of the very first things we talked about, where Milgram did this experiment because he wanted to sort of assess whether, Nazi soldiers who claimed that they were just following orders as they were executing Jewish people, that if that really stood up, because everybody here in America was like, that's a BS excuse. Any person with any sense of decency and morality would never do what you did, regardless of who ordered you to do it. And Milgram was like, I wonder who's right. Are we more likely to follow orders that we've been given because that's what we're supposed to do? Or are we really that strong that we will stand up to authority when we know what we're being told to do is wrong? And remember, he had the experiment set up where volunteers would come in to do this study, and all they were doing was delivering electric shocks to a participant if the participant answered a question wrong. And there would be sort of like an authority figure, someone in charge, standing there in like a white lab coat, clipboard probably, and that person, the authority figure, was in on the experiment. The person being asked the questions and getting shocked was in on the experiment, and there wasn't actually any shocks being given, but the volunteer who was giving the shocks thinks it's all totally legit. They think they are really shocking this person who's answering questions wrong. And with every question they got wrong, the voltage would increase, right? And long story short, Milgram realized that far more people than we would think kept going, even when they didn't want to, even when they knew it was wrong, even when it made them super uncomfortable to keep delivering these increased voltages. Way more people than we would think kept going just because the authority figure kept telling them to keep going. All right, so think back to that. Many students, upon learning about the experiment, right, making his, all of this that he made these students do, these volunteers, a lot of students, when they hear about this experiment, they express moral outrage after learning that Milgram used deception in making his volunteer students believe they were delivering actual electric shock. Was the moral outrage justified? Not the students participating, just like you as a student learning about the experiment. Decades later, when you learn about what Milgram did, a lot of us expressed moral outrage that he used deception to make these volunteers think they were actually delivering electric shock. Is that moral outrage that we feel when we learn about it, is that justified? Why or why not? All right. Question 2. Imagine this scenario. One day, you discover that your neighbor, Joe, who has been living the life of a model citizen, is actually an escaped prisoner. A, should you turn Joe into the authorities? Explain how or why you arrived at your answer. All right, so what would you do and why? B, looking at your response above, evaluate your response and determine if your answer and reasoning reflect the pre-conventional, conventional, or post-conventional stage in your development of moral reasons. This will be going back to Colburn's theory of moral development, right? Those three stages: pre-conventional stage, conventional stage, post-conventional stage. So once you answer A, how you would respond to this situation concerning Joe, and then evaluate that response and determine which stage of moral reasoning that response falls within, right? Question 3. In August 1995, 33-year-old Dalitha Word jumped to her death from the Belle Isle Bridge in Detroit to escape a 19-year-old man who savagely beat her after a fender bender. Dozens of spectators stood by, some even cheering on the attacker. Discuss how an ethical subjectivist would likely respond to this event. Not how you would respond. How would an ethical, well, unless you are an ethical subjectivist, but how would an ethical subjectivist most likely respond to that situation if they were there observing it or learning about it? How would they respond? Question 4. At the beginning of chapter 9, both in the book and in our lesson, we discussed a hypothetical scenario involving steroid use. So I opened up chapter 9, PowerPoint with this, and chapter 9 in the book opens up with this scenario. So referring back to that scenario, use the categorical imperative / golden rule from Kant and the 7 prima facie duties from Ross to decide whether you ought to take the steroids. So if you don't remember that scenario, go back and read it. It's at the beginning of chapter 9. Hypothetical situation. There's a lot of information provided about this hypothetical situation involving steroids. So refamiliarize yourself with that scenario, and then using Kant's theory of the categorical imperative / the golden rule and Ross's 7 prima facie duties that we learned about in chapter 9. Taking both of those into consideration, decide whether you ought to take the steroid and explain. Okay. 5. Head-on collisions. This is an interesting one. So head-on collisions between football players can result in long-term brain trauma. Studies have found that 1 out of 3 ex-NFL players, 1 out of 3 ex-NFL players suffer from long-term brain trauma, including early onset dementia, as a result of these head injuries. Do football players have a moral duty to refrain from playing a game that they know might cause brain injury, or do they have a liberty right to accept the risks? How would each of the following answer this question? So A, how would a utilitarian answer that question? Do football players have a moral duty to refrain from playing this game, or do they have a liberty right to accept the risk and play anyway? How would a utilitarian respond to that question? B, how would a deontologist respond to that question? C, how would a rights-based ethicist respond to that question? And D, how about you? What do you think? Right? So on this one, you do get a chance to express, your moral reasoning behind answering that question. But first, you have to tell me how the other 3 types of moralists would respond to that question. Okay? And number 6. The majority of parents in the United States believe that it is morally acceptable, even praiseworthy, to tell their young children that Santa Claus is a real physical person. Is it morally right to tell children this, even though it is a lie? Support your answer using Kant's categorical imperative, the golden rule. All right, moving on to chapter 13. Remember, chapter 13 is law and politics. So ethics and morality over to law and politics. All right, question 1. Imagine a scenario such as that in William Golding's novel, Lord of the Flies. I don't know if you ever read Lord of the Flies, watched the movie, a bunch of young boys sort of on this, they're deserted. They're on their own. They must fend for themselves and figure out a way to survive. And they're young, like teens, early teens. So imagine a scenario like that in which there is a group of people living without a government or laws. Discuss whether the people in this situation would be better off with or without a government. And to kind of help you with this, you can sort of read the first few pages of chapter 13 again. It kind of, discusses this concept of state of nature and that sort of thing. All right, number 2. Oh my gosh, I love this question so much. To become an American citizen, an immigrant must first pass a test on the history and principles of the U.S. government. Discuss whether passing this test should be a requirement for native-born citizens to be able to vote. Not to be considered citizens, just should they have to also pass this test in order to vote. Relate your answer to the importance of critical thinking skills for effective participation in a democracy. All right, number 3. Franklin D. Roosevelt was a very popular president who was elected for 4 terms. 4. In 1951, the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution limited a president to 2 elected terms of office. Discuss whether the 22nd Amendment is desirable for our democracy. So did they get it right? Or should presidents be able to be elected for more than 2 terms the way Roosevelt was? Number 4, billions of dollars are spent every year on lobbying. You can go to slide 30 of the chapter 13 PowerPoint and see I think it was the top 6 spenders on lobbying for 2018, I think. Billions of dollars spent every year on lobbying. Should the amount of money an organization or business can spend on lobbying and donations to candidates' campaigns be limited? Or does placing limits on lobbying violate the First Amendment? Report your answers. And number 5. In 1982, the Supreme Court ruled that the states must educate undocumented immigrants through the 12th grade, arguing that children of undocumented immigrants need an education to be able to participate economically in society. However, the court said nothing about education at the college level. Should undocumented immigrants who are residents of a state and have been educated in the public schools be eligible for in-state tuition at the state colleges? Support your argument. All right. Again, you can see, having gone through the lessons and chapters for 9 and 13 will be quite useful in answering some of these questions, because you do have to sort of apply some very specific information from those chapters to your answers to some of these questions. So if you are struggling with any of that, definitely reach out. Ethics and morality and law and politics, they are super interesting and, believe it or not, really relevant to us, and extremely relevant to this course on critical thinking. So it's some somewhat heavy information to get through and to think about. So don't hesitate to reach out if you need some extra assistance this week, or just a little more guidance with the questions, whatever it might be. But do your best to have that in by Sunday night. And I look forward to reading your responses to some of those questions.